So we are really taking a socialization angle, trying to understand what the socialization process is when it's very successful for people in extreme contexts. And in the socialization literature, they study the Army quite frequently because it's such an extreme context in which people sort of learn about an organization and what their identity is within that organization. So, by way of introduction, we know from the literature that employees increasingly want to share their identity when they join a workplace, right? This is different than it was generations ago, when people were more willing to say, I'm going to integrate into a company, into kind of their norms and values and expectations. And now people say, I really want to kind of be myself when I'm in an organization. And they're much more willing to leave organizations when they feel that their true identities are not respected or not valued in those companies. The problem comes when you need to socialize people, and socialize people is really getting people to sort of understand the norms and values and the culture of an organization when they enter into it, when they become an employee there. Right? So generally speaking, the socialization literature says that you need to change your identity to fit in with your new organization. And so some organizations in particular, so we might think about the police or people working in a fire department, hospitals, etc., have very strict norms, right? They're dealing with life and death. And so they need people, new employees, to adapt to their cultures very quickly. So for them, right, the socialization process is particularly important. If we look at socialization, we found that people can be socialized in two different ways. And the first is called investiture socialization. And this is where essentially your employer might say, you can keep your identity and become part of our company, right? And this is kind of what people are looking for today, like I would say younger generations, in particular in the past 5 to 10 years. There's the opposite of this, which is called divestiture socialization, which is saying we're going to enforce a new social identity onto you when you join our company. And traditionally, organizations have been inclined towards this divestiture approach. And this is for two reasons. They get two benefits out of doing this. The first is that when divestiture socialization works well, you adopt those norms, you adopt those values of the organization, you're much more likely to be committed to the organization, you're likely to have lower levels of turnover, and people stay there for a long time. They identify with the company. The other benefit for organizations is when you train people, you have this really strong divestiture socialization, so everyone knows how to behave. So you might think about people who are in customer service at like Best Buy or Staples or something like that. As a client or customer, you know what you're getting when you go into that store, right? Because we've all been socialized in the same way. So that has ended up being a competitive advantage for organizations as well. So the problem now, though, is when you use divestiture socialization, people don't have any space to negotiate their role, right? It's harder for them to keep their own identities. And when it doesn't work well, they tend to sort of disidentify with the organization, and there tends to be more feelings of ambivalent identification as well. And there can be turnover in this case. So the question for us now is, how can organizations, when they're forced to use divestiture because they have really strong norms that people need to follow, such as in the Army, how do they use it while limiting the negative consequences of intensive socializations? That's what we wanted to study. Okay, so there are these tensions, right? So we're trying to figure out how do they approach these tensions. And what's really interesting with the Army, and the French Army in particular, is they have an attrition rate of 5%, which is extraordinarily low. And I will note also, because I know this is different, when I presented this to American audiences in particular, there's always this pushback. They say, oh no, but they have to stay there. So I know in the States that when you join the Army as a cadet, you have to sign a contract even before you start training. So you cannot leave. In France, it's not the case. They owe absolutely nothing to the Army, and they can leave at any time. They're totally free to leave, right? So these attrition rates are really true to like what they should be. You lose nothing from leaving anytime within the 3-month socialization period. So we focused on cadets. We went to Army training camps, and we look at the first 3 months of their training because they're all brought to one location and they do their training together as a military cadets. And we conducted interviews over this. So in terms of our data collection, we did 71 formal interviews and then 32 informal interviews, and we also did group interviews. So we're interviewing cadets, so these are the people being trained. They're instructors, okay, who are the ones doing the training with them, essentially. The training camp staff, who are at the training camps all the year through. We also interviewed former cadets to understand people who had gone through it in the past. And then we supplemented this with archival data, videos. We also did observations while they were taking their training classes, performing exercises, and they have certain ceremonies when they do well too. So we also observed those. So we did 120 hours of observation data to supplement the rest of the interview data that we had. So we have our theoretical model, which is a little large. So we're going to go, I'll walk you through this briefly, and then I'll kind of show you the data that's in support of this. So essentially what we found is that they have two main objectives in the socialization itself, right? So it's like, what are you trying to get out of the socializing? What's really important for the Army? So the first is prioritizing the group over the individual. So they want the cadets to say, this group is more important than I am. The group performance matters much more than my individual performance. And they want them to obey authority, essentially, right? So don't question anything we tell you, you just do it. So what happens now? You have these behavioral changes you've got to kind of get through, right? When you want the cadet to be socialized. For them, they enter into this perception of forced adjustment. So you're forcing me to change who I am, essentially, right? So we have to have tactics that address the perceptions of forced adjustment, but also use socialization tactics that are going to lead them to these behavioral changes that you're looking for, right? So in terms of the perception of forced adjustment, how they address that is having a really intense pace of work, the pace at which they're doing the work that they have to do in all their tasks. They have extremely standardized procedures of how the work's getting done. They isolate them from outsiders. That all limits self-reflection and ends up leading to this improved sense of self. In terms of also addressing the perceptions of forced adjustment, we find that they focus on continual improvement. So getting better and better every day, right? First day, I can only run 1 kilometer. The next day, I run 2, 3, 4, etc. And they also make sure that their tasks are also very physically uncomfortable as time goes on, okay? So it doesn't become easier. And so this ended up for the cadets, allowing them to experience a sense of strength revealing. So there'll be people who have said to us, right, like, I didn't know I could, climb up this pole. I didn't know I could run 10 kilometers, etc., right? So for us, this is this idea of strength revealing. And when you limit self-reflection, you have this strength revealing. It ends in this improved sense of self and then leads to their socialization. On the other hand, for the behavioral changes that they're trying to implement, for prioritizing the group, they stress the importance of the group in performance, and they encourage constant group interaction. They're always together. In terms of obedience to authority, the supervisors are exemplary in their behavior, so they see that it's someone they can look up to, and the supervisors provide them an enormous amount of support. That then leads to sort of this trust in the supervisors. Also, because they're together over time, it develops these really strong ties, leading to group cohesion, strong group fit. And so then we're arguing that this improved sense of self and the strong group fit tied together leads to successful socialization. So in terms of behavioral changes, like we said, they want us to go from understand to obey. And keep in mind, right, when we're talking about changes that we've seen in workers, originally, right, when you're thinking about the 60s and 70s, and when you talk about people who were retired from the military, for them this was not difficult, right? This was part of society and how they were brought up. Whereas now people are much more brought up to sort of question authority and be more critical about it. And so for this newer generations, we found that it was harder to sort of get them to obey orders, even if they don't understand them. Then we had this idea of moving from kind of singularity to uniformity, prioritizing the group over yourself. So one of the training camp staff says they all wear the same uniform, they have the same haircut, we call them only by their family name, never by their first name. When they walk, I want to hear one footstep. When they sing, I want to hear one voice. When they're in line, I want to see one head. They have to melt into the group in order to be one, right? That's their objective, that they should all kind of be very similar to one another. And for cadets, this leads to this perception of identity denial, right? So they were surprised at the extent to which they don't have any room to express themselves or be who they want to be. And they can't express their collective identity either. So no reference to their civil collective identity. What I mean by this is, in France, you also have French territories, right? So you have people coming from French Guyana, Mauritius, etc., who are coming in. And for them, their identity is very different from people in French mainland. And so they found this very difficult to adapt to because they cannot express any of that. So the Army has to combat that, essentially, right? So what do? They limit self-reflection. So from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, their days are entirely structured. They have no time to think, no time to rest, no time to think about the fit. They standardize the processes. So every instructor will say, this is the way you make your bed. And every instructor will tell them the same thing. So then they stop questioning anyone, right? Because they know what needs to get done. They're also cut off from the rest of the world. So the first 3 weeks, you're not allowed to use your phone and you're not allowed to go home. So they don't get to see anyone from home. They don't get to see their friends. They're living together and they are completely isolated from the rest of the world. So this cadet says, the third interview, so we did interviews at months 1, 2, and 3. And at the third, this person is saying, in the end, you learn to just focus on the present moment. Before you can ask yourself if you fit in, you've already adjusted, right? So this is how they're kind of limiting self-reflection here and commenting that effect that you might have a forced adjustment or lack of identity. Now, in terms of achieving kind of group prioritization, they stress the importance of the group and performance. They always award group awards to group performance as opposed to individual performance. And there's constant group interaction as well. So this cadet says, we're always together, we do everything together, we share the good and the bad moments so that it tightens very quickly the bonds between us. They sleep together in the same place, they eat together, they do all the training together. They even have very limited time to take showers, so they end up taking showers together essentially as well, okay? So it's like no time for anything else. You know, cadets are saying, I can't even cry by myself because there's no privacy, right? In terms of obedience to authority, the instructors themselves display really exemplary behavior, right? So if you want someone to trust authority, you have to show that the authority is worth valuing and worth trusting. And so every time a cadet is punished, so for example, if you drop your female, which is the name of the gun that they use, they will have to do 25 push-ups. But the instructor will also do the 25 push-ups with that cadet. And then if the next cadet is slow in running, they say run another kilometer, and the instructor will run the kilometer with them, okay? So the instructors always do even more than the individual cadets are doing. So the cadets are saying, you know, they're even, you know, they run themselves harder than we run ourselves, essentially. And so they have a lot of respect for them. They check on all of their injuries as well. They come to see them in their bunks afterwards and ask, you know, about the injuries that they had. So a cadet says the instructor's goals is really to get everyone to the end of the training and do everything they can to get us to follow them. They motivate us all the time. They give us advice all the time. They visit us in the rooms. They cheer us up if we have a setback or if we're injured. We feel really supported. So they go and they're really supportive of them, right? Which I think is something that's somewhat surprising compared to what we sort of traditionally think of as military training. All right, in terms of group cohesion, they give them some opportunities for self-expression if there's high cohesion. So when there's good performance and high cohesion, they let them have little ceremonies and do things where they can express themselves. But if there's low cohesion, low performance, then they reduce any opportunities for self-reflection. And the instructors themselves over time tend to reveal more of their personality if they feel that things are going well, and that favors the development of trusting relationships as well. All right, so if we're saying that, you know, once you kind of have this new identity that you have, your improved sense of self and the strong group fit, we think that that's sort of the magic combination that leads to successful socialization and this 5% or less attrition rate. So cadets who become attached to the institution and its values, they start to embody the institution. So a training staff member says, I can tell you just by looking at a cadet which week of training he's at, the way he talks or walks, even informally with his friends. Although the training staff is saying there are females here who are part of the cadets. Because you become a soldier, the Army changes you. When you become a soldier, the Army changes you and you become a part of it, right? So you start to embody the institution. There's no room for ambivalent identification in this process. So the cadet, again, at the end, so third interview at the end of 3 months says, I understood that I'm part of a group and that without them, I'm nothing. In civilian life, they don't teach you these things, right? So you become totally immersed in your new institution and they feel better about it as well. All right, so in terms of our theoretical contributions, generally investiture and divestiture approaches tend to be opposed in the literature. We're showing here that even when you have to use really strong divestiture approaches, you can use a bit of the investitures, particularly at the end, where people can feel good about their identity. Usually socialization doesn't look at group level dynamics. They look very much at the role of the supervisor, the organization in changing the individual. And here we see that the group plays a role as well. And we find ways to kind of mitigate the negative effects of intensive divestiture. So things like limiting the opportunities for self-reflection and looking at the strength revealing piece, right, which can improve your sense of self-continuity. In terms of limitations on future research, so there is a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of socialization research that takes place in the Army, but there is limited generalizability, right? You can't think that most companies are going to be able to socialize in the same way that the Army does, essentially. But we think the findings are relevant for sort of extreme institutions, so things like medical institutions, prisons, fire stations, police, etc. And of course, we only studied the first 3 months of their training. This was by necessity because that's really how they set up the training in the Army. But naturally, people are less likely to express themselves during the very first period, I would say. And so there might have been some of those effects there, essentially. So you might want to study this over a longer time period. Okay, thank you.